This week on the Wake and Bake podcast,
I'm a way better driver.
Oh my God, this is going to cause everyone to crash.
The fact that I've survived personally, not saying that I text a lot, I would never admit that on a podcast, but
Show us your evil numbers. And they would be like, we don't have evil numbers to show you.
Cannabis is confusing. It's the Wake and Bake podcast. This is going to be our theme song.
I take allergy meds. I've driven on THC. I text, like, watch out, Washington. She's out there somewhere, folks.
Seriously, someone's going to start hiring me a tuk-tuk to drive me around.
We're going to play a fun game of, do you think cannabis use causes more accidents or less accidents than these like kind of common medications?
Yes, nerd.
We're going to start out this podcast by saying that, of course, you should never drive intoxicated. And just in case you like listen to the rest of what we say here and you get a different idea in your head, again, we're going to repeat it. You should not drive when you're intoxicated, high, stoned, impaired, elevated, anything that's going to make you, be a danger to yourself and others. Like, don't do it. But as a cannabis user myself who rarely feels intoxicated from THC, I've always wondered about like, how bad is it to drive on THC? Is it as bad as driving drunk? I don't think anybody thinks that. But what about people who are taking painkillers or mood stabilizers? Is driving with THC more or less dangerous than those things are? And if you ask frequent cannabis users about driving with THC in their system, you'll likely hear that they think that they're doing just fine, or in some cases, they feel like they're even much better drivers when they're using THC because they're more cautious and chill and they drive more slowly. On the flip side, if you've asked somebody who's only tried THC a couple of times, like, hey, would you drive when you were like that? They will probably say like, absolutely not. So that like brings up a lot of questions. And the good news is that we do have some answers to some of these questions, and we're going to discuss them today on the Wake and Bake podcast. I'm Andrea Maharg. I've been a cannabis educator for 6 years now, and I'm joined by my fabulous co-host and the founder of the Cannabis Coaching Institute, Corinne Tobias. Corinne, if I had to guess, I'd say you're going to fall into the camp of like, oh my God, I would never drive when I'd had THC. Is that fair?
No. It's interesting when I saw that you had put this question in here. I was like, no, I would never drive high, but would I drive with some THC in my system? Yeah, there are plenty of times when I'm taking, say, one of my gummies, right? Which when I cut it in half, it's like, 1 milligram of THC or whatever. Maybe, no, like it's like 1.25. That's what it is when I cut it in half. And it's incredibly impactful for any kind of breakthrough pain I have or any kind of flare-ups that are going on. And I have no problem with driving with a small amount of THC in my system. So the only problem that I have with it, and I'm excited to dig into this, is like, would I get in trouble? Would I get in trouble from like 1.25 milligrams of THC in my system, even though I don't feel impaired at all? And I actually, like you're talking about, when I have high levels of pain, or if I haven't had this lately, but high levels of anxiety, when I get behind the wheel of a car, it is very difficult for me to process all the information that is going on around me. And I do feel like when I have a high level of CBD, even with like a small amount of THC, I do feel like I can pay attention to those things. I can process, more effectively.
Okay, I really wasn't expecting you to say that, because my experience of like consuming cannabis with you was just the one time when we were hanging out in Mexico and you smoke like, a puff and a half off of a joint, and you were giggly for like hours.
Hang on. First of all, I wouldn't have driven after that puff. That was very strong cannabis.
Okay.
That was very strong cannabis. And I don't typically inhale cannabis, and has very different impacts for me. So those are two things. And also, I did not drive. We took a tuk-tuk.
It's true. Yeah, we didn't drive.
I wouldn't have driven on that, no. I mean, I wish I could just take a tuk-tuk everywhere. I would probably consume a lot more THC if there were just tuk-tuks available, and I could just get a little bit elevated and just like tuk-tuk around. Alas, not in the Pacific Northwest. We don't have a tuk-tuk company just yet. Well, Andrea, given that THC can have drastically different effects on people depending on their individual endocannabinoid system and how often and how much they consume, how are we supposed to approach this driving issue if we don't have a team of tuk-tuks to drive us around?
I'm super glad you asked because, as we both know, we are both cannabis book nerds, and I am just finishing this really wonderful book called Seeing Through the Smoke by Peter Grinspoon. It has a chapter on driving with THC, which is what we're going to dive into today. But before we do that, I'm going to take you on a little detour here because I want to properly place Peter Grinspoon in cannabis history lore because he has a very specific place. So his dad is Lester Grinspoon. You may have heard of him. He was a psychiatrist, a longtime professor at Harvard's medical school, and starting in the late 60s, he became a tenacious cannabis advocate. Over his career, he published close to 200 studies. He spoke in front of Congress. He made media appearances and was instrumental in many ways in helping move along the legalization efforts. And he wrote a book, back to books, in 1971 called Marijuana Reconsidered, which really did kind of shift public perception in lots of ways. It even made it onto the front page of the New York Times books section. So people were paying attention to this. And guess who Lester Grinspoon used to smoke weed with? Your dude, Carl Sagan. Yeah. They were friends and also colleagues. They would spend hours together on the weekends discussing cannabis and psychedelics and drug policy in Lester's living room.
I love that so much. I don't know really anything about Lester Grinspoon except for the things that you've shared with me, and I know this is just a coincidence that I'm wearing a turtleneck, but I love Carl Sagan and his turtlenecks. And for those of you who listened to the cannabis and sex episode that we produced a couple of months ago, we did a whole thing on Carl Sagan. So if you haven't listened to it, make sure you go get it. But I love Carl Sagan. Anyone who hangs out with Carl Sagan is a brilliant, wonderful human in my book. So tell me how this has anything to do with driving, or if you just wanted to take me on a little tangent where I thought about Carl Sagan.
And brought up your turtleneck. No, I'm going to bring it back around to THC. So Lester Grinspoon and Carl Sagan are hanging out on weekends, smoking weed and discussing all of this stuff. And who is peeking around the corner into the living room but Lester's son, Peter, who wrote the book that I just finished reading. Peter Grinspoon is now himself a ferocious cannabis advocate. And he wrote this book, Seeing Through the Smoke. And here we are. We made it back. We're going to talk about driving on THC because of the chapter in this book where he really dives into what do we actually know? And not just what do the studies say, but what are the studies leaving out, or who is funding the study? All of these things. It was a really excellent chapter on kind of teasing apart what we know.
All right. Tell me everything. Tell me what we need to know about THC and driving and whether or not it's okay or it's terrible. And we all just need to start walking everywhere, taking the bus system.
But before we dive into the episode, if you are thinking about starting your own cannabis business or getting into the cannabis industry, one of the most important things that you can do for yourself is to get really well educated on this plant. As you've heard on the podcast, there is a lot to dive into. And if you're going to be in this space, it's important that you know as much as possible about this and that you can talk to other people about it so that you can be an ambassador for the plant. At the Cannabis Coaching Institute, our certified cannabis educator program gives you all the knowledge and skills that you need to be able to confidently talk about this plant and how beautiful and wonderful and magical it is. And we teach you how to be out there in the world talking about it digitally so that as you grow your business, you're taking advantage of where the people are actually at on podcasts, on videos, checking out social media. If being your own boss in the cannabis industry sounds like a great deal to you, head over to www.cannabiscoachinginstitute.com and check out the Certified Cannabis Educator Program. You can be certified in as little as 3 months, and then you can be out there changing the world as well. Okay, so there is, in my opinion, kind of no right answer on this because it is so nuanced. So let's start off with cannabis users' perception versus reality. So many cannabis users think that they're better drivers, although this has never been proven in a driving simulator yet. We also know that cannabis users think that they're ready to drive after consuming THC, possibly hours before they are really ready to drive. So that's kind of like a 1-2 punch, right? We think we're better drivers and we think we're ready to drive before we really are. So you might think oh, full stop, we shouldn't be consuming cannabis before driving, but the numbers tell a different story. So It depends on the study, but the risk of driving after consuming THC is kind of like 0.1 fold to 0.9 fold. So you're like 0.1 to 0.9 times more likely, not even double as likely to get into an accident if you're using cannabis than if you were sober. And I'm not sure if that like less than double number or almost the same number feels like more than you thought, like you're much more likely to be in an accident than you thought, or much less likely to be in an accident that you thought. But regardless, when you take that number and multiply it over the 35 million people who are using cannabis monthly in the United States, that's a significant impact, right? Like that's a lot of accidents that didn't need to happen because people were consuming cannabis and maybe weren't ready to drive.
Okay, I have so many questions about this because, as you said, it's a very nuanced conversation. And when you gave me all of these statistics, which I love, by the way, I love that we have statistics on it. But my mind automatically goes to compared to what? Like right now, we're comparing this to someone who's stone cold sober, like absolutely, like, well, it's so hard to say not on anything. I mean, like sugar, caffeine, like we could say a lot of things. Did they just pound a Nutri-Grain bar? They're like flying high. But like those things have a lot of sugar in them. Anywho, or like so somebody is completely stone cold sober, and then someone who uses cannabis, which is such a broad spectrum. But like, what if we're comparing someone who's using cannabis, even with that broad spectrum, and something like booze, right? Like how much? It's almost 2 times for cannabis. What is it for booze?
Yeah, up to almost 2 times for cannabis. So like depending on the study, maybe closer to sober. But in both cases, for alcohol and for cannabis, the devil is in the details. Of course, if you are consuming high amounts of THC, you're ripping on your vape pen or your bong or your dab and you're super intoxicated, that's a different story than what you were just talking about. And the same thing with alcohol. But here's the thing with alcohol, when you are at just the legal limit, so 0.08 blood alcohol content, you are 4 times as likely to get into an accident or a crash than a sober driver. And that's at the legal limit. So even somebody who is just moderately over the legal limit, so 0.1 blood alcohol content, you're 20 times as likely to crash. Yes, I know. So it's not even kind of the same conversation here. And we know that when people consume more alcohol, they are more impaired, but the same doesn't necessarily hold true for cannabis. So if you're new to cannabis or you consume like fairly infrequently, a little bit of cannabis might impair you totally, like we were talking about earlier. But if you are a long time chronic or daily cannabis user, a 2021 study just showed that those people experience less impairment than occasional users. So it is complicated and nuanced, and it gets even more complicated.
Tell me more. How does it get more complicated than what is always? This is the Wake and Bake podcast. It should be called Cannabis is Complicated.
We're rebranding, folks. Okay, so I want to preface this part of the podcast with the fact that we're not endorsing driving after consuming, but in the book, Peter Grinspoon delves deeper into some of the research and comes up with some really interesting numbers. So a 2022 meta-analysis, and that just means that the researchers have looked at lots of different studies and they're drawing their own conclusions from those studies. This meta-analysis looked at cannabis impaired driving and adjusted those studies for biases. I know you're not going to be shocked to find out that there are inherent biases against cannabis use and users baked into many of these studies. And once they adjusted for these biases by playing some like computer math number games again, they weren't putting anyone in a simulator. Their conclusion was that driving after cannabis is much less risky than driving after drinking or speeding or using your cell phone. And then let's forget about speeding, texting, alcohol. Let's think about some of the collision risks when you're on other substances. A 2021 study reviewed the increased crash risk of several commonly used medications. We're going to play a fun game of, do you think cannabis use causes more accidents or less accidents than these like kind of common medications? So what do you think the number is on allergy meds? If cannabis is 1.1 to 1.9, what's allergy meds?
I think cannabis is worse than allergy meds.
Okay.
Cannabis is more likely to you're more likely to get in a crash. I'd probably say allergy meds. Everybody takes allergy meds. It's springtime here. Maybe it's twice as impairing, twice as likely to get in a crash as allergy meds.
1.4 it comes out to, so right in between. Okay. What about Ambien, sleep medication?
Oh, Ambien has to be worse. I know people like go in and like eat their entire fridges when they're on Ambien. I don't think it'd be good to operate a vehicle on it. I'd say Ambien is three times as more likely to get you in a crash.
It says 1.4. This study came out with 1.4 again. So again, along the same lines of as impairing as allergy meds. Like, what kind of allergy meds are these people taking is what I want to know. Okay, what about benzos, mood stabilizing drugs in general?
I'd say, well, now I feel like I keep overshooting it. So twice as likely on
they
benzos.
say 1.6 to 2.3. So probably more impairing than THC. And then opioids, which I found really surprising. And so did Peter Grinspoon. He was like, what the hell? Opioids, they said like 1.9 to 2.2. And in this particular study that we're talking about, where they gave you all these other like numbers, they put the risk of using cannabis at 1.1 to 1.4 times as likely to cause a collision. So that is the same or less than allergy meds and Ambien, and less than benzos and opioids.
So, but if I were talking to someone, in the PTA, and I was like, "Oh, I took my allergy medication, and then I went for a Sunday drive," nobody would give any fucks. But if I said like, "Oh, I used a bit of cannabis and went for a Sunday drive," they'd be like, "The horrors!" Like clutching pearls and all of that. So that's that really is interesting. Even though I think I kind of failed that game, I'm happy we played.
Yeah, I found it really interesting as well and shocking. That's why I wanted to have this podcast, because I was like, what? And I know that you want to know the stats on texting. So you want to hear those?
I want to hear the stats on texting because I would never do that. I would never text and drive. I'm kidding. I really don't try to, but sometimes I have a unicorn squirrel brain, and sometimes I'm like, ding, ding, oh shoot. And then I'm doing it. I'm not alone. I'm pretty sure most people have that phenomenon, right? I'm not alone. I feel like there's shame just circling around me right now for admitting that I do occasionally text while
I take
driving.
allergy meds. I've driven on THC. I text, like, watch out, Washington. She's out there somewhere, folks.
Seriously, someone's going to start hiring me a tuk-tuk to drive me around. This is my goal. I'm going to take to the bicycle. Yeah, I want to know the comparison. How dangerous is it when I shoot off a text compared to, if I were using THC? 23
times as likely, according to the Federal Highway Administration. No. 23 times. Cannabis, maybe twice as likely. Okay. Texting, 23 times as likely.
I'm absolutely sure that there's angels, because we're all doing it. Like, because if we're supposed to be getting all these wrecks, the fact that, so every time I get in a car and I text, I'm 23 times more likely to get in a car accident. Every time I get in a car, if I've used cannabis, and again, this is very nebulous, I'm maybe twice as likely, probably closer to not being impaired, probably as close to, using an allergy medicine. If it's as small as the THC that I use and have been using for years, it's probably closer to nil, right? At that point.
Yeah.
All right. Well, can we look at something? Because I want to know now, like, the real numbers on this. Like, have crashes increased in places that have legalized cannabis, just like they have in places that have access to cell phones?
That was the big fear, right? As states, especially across the United States, legalized, they were always like, well, oh my God, this is going to cause everyone to crash. And one study that I looked at that spanned pre and post legalization in Canada showed that legalization was not associated with any change in traffic injuries. They speculate in this study that it was due to increased law enforcement and education. And we actually do have a pretty robust, like, don't drive high education campaign here in Canada. People have like a general idea that we shouldn't be doing this. And then even
hang on. We have don't drink and drive campaigns, and that we know that, like, you're really saying that telling people not to smoke and drive has, maybe in Canada, you guys are pretty law abiding up there. I can't imagine that Americans are the same. We're like, no,
Um,
don't tell me what to do.
This is what the study attributed the non-existent increase in crashes to, was law enforcement and education. But it's not just Canada. The same thing happened in Colorado and Oregon when they legalized. Like, other states would come to them and say, like, show us your evil numbers, and they would be like, we don't have evil numbers to show you. So it is one of the reasons why legalization has been able to like sweep the world, is that legalizing cannabis isn't causing massive crashes. And in fact, if you look at auto insurance claims, there was a study that was done in 2022, and they stated that auto insurance claims actually go down after medical cannabis was legalized. And they speculate that this is because people are replacing more dangerous things like alcohol or opiates or medications with cannabis. And they estimated that legalizing medical cannabis reduced health expenditures related to car accidents by $820 million a year.
That's insane. That's insane. And maybe part of it could be attributed to, and I'm just spitballing here, like maybe you're a little bit high, you get in the car, and then you're like, I don't need my phone, man. I want to be one with the road. I don't care what Karen is texting me about. Maybe it's also like you don't even want to text. You don't want to drink. You don't want to text. You're like, life is good. Okay, obviously that's not the case. But I do know when you were researching this episode that you came across a statistic that you actually didn't want to put in the podcast because you were afraid that people would voice clip this and take it out of context and make it sound like you were endorsing driving on THC. But I think this is really important. I really want you to share it. So if you're listening to this right now, you are absolutely 100% prohibited from voice clipping Andrea right now and just taking this out of context, because she already said earlier in the podcast, like, we are not endorsing using a bunch of THC and driving or using any THC at all. We're not endorsing any of that. But I do want you to share this statistic because I think it's important for us to get context around this issue.
Do you remember that meta-analysis I was talking about earlier where they looked at all those studies and then adjusted them for biases?
Yes, nerd.
They found that drivers using cannabis were actually less likely to get into car accidents than sober drivers. So instead of being like 1.1 to 1.9 times as likely, you're actually like 0.68. So you have a protective effect possibly on driving. Now, I want you to remember that this was like a number crunching studies. Again, they didn't do like research on people and gave them THC and told them to drive, but that stat alone like was mind blowing to me. Like, maybe the cannabis users are right. Maybe they are. Maybe some of them are better.
I'm a way better driver.
Like, Andrea said it on the podcast.
Yeah, she's right. She knows what she's talking about. I'm driving right now. Oh my goodness. Well, you know, what's interesting about that statistic is that you were talking about some of the practical ways that this has been measured, right? And the states are like, no, this isn't creating more car accidents. And the insurance companies are like, actually, we have fewer and we think it's because of these things. And then, you know, when you're talking about this meta-analysis saying that it might be protective, and like we grew this whole thing out of anecdotal evidence, right? Cannabis is healthy started from people being like, hey, actually, this thing that is prohibited, this feels really good in my body and I think it's healthy. You know, I don't want to dismiss people who have that experience, especially people who've been using cannabis as medicine and have to drive from A to B and they have a tolerance that's developed so they're not impaired or intoxicated. And they're like, I actually am more aware. I'm more present when I'm driving. I don't want to discount that for people because that might be their experience. And it might be, according to some of this data, true. It might be actually legitimate.
But it doesn't matter. And this is where we come back to everything in cannabis is super complicated. So even though we have this information that says that cannabis is impairing for many people, but not as impairing as certainly as texting, when you were saying earlier that you get nervous about driving on THC, that's because if you got pulled over, even you as a 1.25 milligram THC user could fail one of these roadside tests. So the roadside tests that we have that check for impairment right now, like Basically, they suck. There's several problems with them. You can test positive for THC in your system literally weeks after consumption. The metabolites are stored in your fat, and they get slowly released. So you could have consumed cannabis 3 weeks ago and you get pulled over today. The officer thinks that you're impaired for whatever reason, gives you a roadside test, and you can fail. You can test positive on those tests even if you're consuming a CBD rich type of cannabis. If it even has a touch of THC, again, that can build up in your system over time. Importantly, you can test negative on the roadside impairment test, but still be impaired because you had just a little bit of THC, but you're a new or infrequent user. And although it was just a little bit, it impaired you to the point that you shouldn't have been driving. And like you said, testing positive doesn't mean that you were impaired while driving, because maybe you are a medical user on very low doses and you've built up tolerance. Unlike alcohol, having elevated levels of THC in your blood or your urine or your saliva does not correlate with elevated levels of intoxication. And if you're infrequent or lightweight, it doesn't even kind of capture that in those tests. Some jurisdictions do have drug enforcement officers who are trained to like really understand. They get called to the scene like, hey, is this person impaired or not? But their numbers are scary too. They have an accuracy rate of about 67% and a false positive rate of about 35%. Who are the people who are going to be falsely imprisoned or incarcerated for, detection of cannabis that wasn't really there? It's gonna be the people of color in both of our countries that this is happening to, for people who were not impaired, because we don't have great methods of detection.
Such bullshit. Okay, so this isn't supposed to be a rant episode, but I want to know, like, what are people doing? I mean, surely there have to be court cases, there have to be ways that we can fight this, right?
There is. And this is what I hear all the time is like, oh, if I ever got pulled over, I would fight it because, like I know about cannabis and I know about THC and tolerance and all of these things. And there have been court cases that I've gone through, even up to like Supreme Courts. But nobody yet has changed the rules based on what we know. So in Washington, where you live, a man was pulled over not too long ago. The police officer suspected he was impaired. When he got pulled over, the officer noticed that he was wearing a dispensary name tag. And eventually he was found to have almost the double the limit of THC allowed in his blood. Although he said he hadn't consumed in 20 hours. He was a regular user, but hadn't consumed in almost a full day and did not feel impaired. He fought his DUI charge all the way to the Washington Supreme Court, and they cut him down. Here in Ontario, same thing happened. A man filed a constitutional challenge of Canada's law that sets out the legal limit for impaired driving for THC. And in his case, which also got struck down, the judge said, like, yeah, I know that this law is going to affect frequent and chronic users of cannabis, but it does so in a way that does not violate the principles of fundamental justice. So she was just kind of like, screw it. Law stays the same. You're getting the punishment.
Because they don't have a better option, is what what the argument is. It's like, well, this is the best we've got, right? That's the whole argument.
It is the best that we all have. Do you know, like this is what we have as trying to figure out if people are impaired. And this is an extremely important job. Like impaired people should not be out there on the roads. It's just that the tests that we have to determine impairment for cannabis users do not work well. And you are fucking up people's lives if they're, found to be guilty of driving impaired when they really weren't. And you're fucking up people's lives if you drive while impaired and go hurt somebody. So, this is both sides of that sword.
Cannabis is confusing. It's the Wake and Bake podcast. This is going to be our theme song because it feels like this is another podcast. We've been doing this is our second season. And I don't know that we've released a single podcast where we get to the end and we're like, and that's how it goes. And this is straightforward because it's another one. We try to answer a simple question. Should you or should you not drive while consuming THC? Is it too impairing? Is it going to cause crashes? And it turns out we can't simplify it again. And we do know that cannabis users think they're really good drivers, but in many cases, they're at least mildly impaired. But we also know that they're almost 23 times less likely to cause a crash than the millions of people who are out there texting on the daily and who are as impaired as people taking allergy meds. And insurance companies and states are saying, well, it really actually doesn't make an impact. But if you're a daily user, even if you're not using and you're not impaired, because of the way the tests are set up, you can still lose your license, go to jail, have to deal with all the other things that a DUI, which again, drinking and driving, is much more impairing, even at the legal limit.
Yep, you're right. There is no good answer here. Of course, I'm going to reiterate for like the 50th time that driving while impaired is never a good idea. But for most day-to-day users and especially medical users who use it on the daily, the situation is just more complicated than that. If you're interested in learning more and like diving into all these cool studies, make sure that you pick up the book called Seeing Through the Smoke by Peter Grinspoon. And remember to subscribe to the podcast and turn on notifications. Our podcast release schedule is a little bit sometimes sporadic, and we definitely don't want you to miss an episode. Finally, if you're listening to this and you know that you want to incorporate the healing potential of cannabis into your existing health or wellness business, or if you want to get out there and teach other people about this miraculous plant and how it works and all the intricacies of it and how nuanced it is, if you want to do this type of work, please make sure that you check out the Cannabis Coaching Institute. We're at cannabiscoachinginstitute.com. We've been going since 2018 and we have graduated over 600 students. We would love to have you come join us. Again, cannabiscoachinginstitute.com. Can you stop stomping, please? Just like be a quiet cereal eater. Thanks.
He's going to be your Peter Grinspoon. You better watch out. Our children are soaking up.
We've already talked about this with him specifically. It's Keller. And like, yeah, he's going to be interesting.